Backseas Musical Podcast.
Resistance is useless!
For those of us Americans who are old enough to remember the Northern Irish conflict back in the 1960s and 70s, it was a conflict that you'd see on the news, but for many of us, it just seemed like a violent skirmish between Catholics and Protestants. It wasn't. It was something much more complicated. This is a 30-year struggle over independence and about home rule. It was a bloody conflict that involved rioting, bombing, and assassinations until both sides eventually signed an accord in 1998. But to grow up in Dublin during that conflict was a tense and politically turbulent time, and it had a deep effect on the people who lived there, like Jake Burns, Henry Clooney, Ally McMurtry, and Brian Falloon, who went on to form one of the most important bands in the midst of the chaos of Northern Ireland. They were the band Stiff Little Fingers. And Stiff Little Fingers was a band that was formed during the very first wave of punk music in the mid-1970s. But their place in punk history is completely unique, being that they were the first band in history to crack the British charts on a completely independent record label, a record label which had never released a full-length record before. It's 1977, and Stiff Little Fingers was formed in Belfast, Ireland. And despite the troubles in Ireland at the time, the band consisted of Catholic and Protestant members. Soon after they got together, reporter Gordon Ogilvie suggested to Jake Burns that he start writing songs that are personal, about things that he knew, about things that he was seeing in Belfast. And Jake did, quickly writing the band's very first single, Suspect Device, with the B-side called Wasted Life. It was released on their own label, Rigid Digits, in early 1978. The single got into the hands of John Peel, the famous British disc jockey from the BBC, who started playing the single on his show every single night. Soon, Stiff Little Fingers would find themselves thrust into the spotlight and eventually signing with Rough Trade Records, who wanted to branch out into releasing albums even though they had never done it before. So in 1979, the label released the band's very first full-length album called Inflammable Material. It contained a number of big hits like Suspect Device and Alternative Ulster and several others, and became the first album released by an independent record label to reach number 14 on the British charts. The band is still together today. In fact, Stiff Little Fingers were set to perform at several festivals this year with their 2020 Vision Tour. Unfortunately, many of those dates were postponed due to the pandemic. But the band's story is a fascinating one, and Jake Burns has been in the center of all of it. This is my conversation with Jake Burns from Stiff Little Fingers on Backseas Musical Podcast. I have to ask you, like I ask everybody else, are you feeling okay? Are you getting through all this?
Yeah, I mean, physically, yes. I have a feeling that I actually probably had. I think I had the thing and it went away. We just started a UK tour when the world closed down. But earlier in the year, in February, we were out in the Far East, and obviously this had just sort of, it was a ripple at this point. We were aware of it. And bizarrely, it's something that I wouldn't normally do, is get a flu shot. But I thought, since I'm going to be going to Japan and Singapore, at the time we were supposed to be going to Hong Kong, which seemed very close to it. I popped along to my doctor, and actually he gave me not just a flu shot, but a pneumonia shot. And I think that might have saved my bacon, because I basically, two of the guys in the band did come down with pretty bad doses. And myself and our guitar player, who both live in the United States, we flew home. And literally had like 2 or 3 days of shivering and shaking, and then felt fine. So I think I may have dodged a bullet. But yeah, I mean, so physically I'm fine. Mentally, probably the same as everybody else, climbing the walls a bit. But what are you going to do?
But you guys, like you said, you were starting this tour, and there were Asia dates, there were certainly European dates. I saw dates in Scotland. Were there any?
Yeah.
What exactly led to that moment where you say, okay, you know what, we have to reconsider this, and we have to reschedule or attempt to reschedule some of these dates?
Well, I mean, obviously some of the shows were being cancelled. Scotland moved a bit quicker than England did on this, and they basically restricted gatherings of more than 500 people before before England did anything, because they've got like a sort of a form of devolved government up in Scotland, so they moved faster. And I mean, obviously, our shows were bigger than 500, so Scotland was taken out of the equation for us. We managed to do 3 shows, and it was obvious that people were already starting to get slightly nervous about coming out. I mean, you could see from the stage that the number of people in the audience weren't the number of people that bought tickets. I mean, a lot more people bought tickets than actually turned up. So, you felt that tide of public opinion was definitely starting to err on the side of caution. And we waited and waited and waited we holed up in a hotel for like 3 or 4 days, waiting for some form of guideline from Boris Johnson, and nothing was forthcoming. And the longer it went on, just the more we realized it was going to be irresponsible to do this, because they were starting to say that, well, maybe we'll allow you to gather, and it's still okay to go to the pub or whatever, go to a restaurant. And we were thinking, well, but they were saying to exercise caution. And that was the thing. They wouldn't actually definitively say, don't do this. So, they were saying you would exercise caution. We wouldn't recommend it, but you can still do it if you want. And so we just took the decision that if it's, if you don't feel safe in a bar, which has probably only got like 40 or 50 people in it, you're definitely not going to feel safe in a room with 2,000 people in it. So it was just, it was just common sense to go, do you know what? Let's just reschedule these if we can. Of course, we rescheduled for, this was early March, middle of March. And, we were thinking that by, August, September, this will all be clear. And I'm beginning to think now that it probably won't be. I mean, we've got the tour dates are all rearranged for them, but, realistically, and I mean, nothing has changed since then. We're still hoping that we can go and do them, but you really wouldn't want to put your pension on it at the moment, would you?
No, and you guys were going to do a number of festivals. I know there were a bunch of festivals here in the States that for the same reason. It's one thing to have a group of 10 people. It's another thing to have a group of a couple thousand people spread out over 3 days.
Yeah, I mean, the festivals have pretty much all started to fall by the wayside as well. I mean, the one main one that we were doing here, we were trying to leave the US alone, because we did like a 6 or 7 week tour of the country last year. And that seemed, we don't want to outstar our welcome. We thought, we'll leave America alone this year, and we'll do it again next year. But we got the offer to go and do the Punk Rock Bowling Festival in Vegas. And we'd done that before, and it was a lot of fun, and, they're nice people to work with. So we were like, well, yeah, that'll be fun. We'll do that. And we can put in a couple of club shows. We had a couple of club shows on the West Coast, put in around it. One of our favorite venues ever was the Slims in San Francisco, which unfortunately has closed completely now. I mean, I don't think that was actually anything to do with the current epidemic. I think they were probably planning on closing down anyway. But I think this just probably hastened the decision a bit. But, so those have all gone by the wayside, and I believe we're hoping to. I think that the plan is at the moment to try and rearrange that for the same time next year. And hopefully we can do that.
The tour that you guys were going to be on included the professionals with Paul Cook and Tom Spencer and TV Smith from the Adverts. Is that still going to be the same lineup for potentially next year, or that may change?
At the moment, we've like I said, we have the dates for the UK rearranged for September, and yes, everybody has said that they're available to do it. So yes, that'll still be the professionals and TV Smith will still be doing that, assuming we get the go ahead to do it. But I mean, that's the problem with things as they stand, Mike, is that nobody can second guess this thing. I mean, there's every day you're hearing different. I mean, I live in Chicago, and just the very earliest that that we'll be looking at doing that anybody would be looking at doing anything here would be June, and that's I don't mean what we do for a living. I'm talking about just it's all second guessing at the moment. Nobody knows.
Everybody wants to get back to some level of normalcy, but not too soon. It just I don't know if people are ready to gather in groups or go back to the office or what. I think there's so much unknown.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing. I think even when you're told, okay, we've got a handle on this and you can start to go and do these things again, there's bound to be an amount of trepidation about, because I think until a reliable vaccine's developed, there is going to be that sense of nervousness, and you see that the couple of places around the world that have sort of gone a bit preemptive on this and started to reopen, and they're already starting to see a second wave of infection come through. So, it's not something that's just going to go away on its own, I don't think. Sadly, it's going to be something we're just going to have to contend with for the rest of our lives, even if there is a vaccine. It doesn't strike me as something like polio or whatever that they can eliminate. I think it's going to be a bit like it'll be a nastier variant of flu season. But that's just me. So, bringing my own little personal crystal ball out,
So I'm old enough to remember, watching the news as a kid, and watching stories on the news about the troubles in Northern Ireland, and we were kind of given somewhat of a homogenized view of that time and that conflict, and I think it probably didn't do it justice. It was much more complicated than just a simple Catholic versus Protestant situation. Growing up in that environment as a kid, how did that shape you? Obviously, it affected your music, but individually speaking, that experience had to be incredibly profound for you and your family.
I think everybody dealt with it in different ways, and it all depended on where you lived and where you grew up and how your parents reacted to it. That's the thing, and in a way, the tragedy of Ireland actually as a country through its entire history is it more so than a lot of places, it really is bound to its history, and so these weren't conflicts that just sort of manifested in 1978. Or 68 rather. They came to a head then, but the actual sort of underlying problems have been around a lot longer. And actually, in a bizarre mirror, one of the main reasons that things did come to a head in 1968 is because they were taking a lead from the civil rights associations here. They saw the marches in like Selma and the Martin Luther King effect here, and they felt that their time because Catholics were treated very much as second-class citizens in Northern Ireland, and I think they saw a lot of parallels between what was happening here and what was happening to them. So there was a lot of there was a lot of mirroring went on, and it was almost a spark to it. But again, same thing happened in I think there were riots in Paris in '68 as well, were there, like the student riots and stuff. So it's like I said, a lot of how you dealt with it and how you came through it depended on where you grew up, who you were surrounded by as you grew up. Everything was viewed, from a bunch of different perspectives, even within a small area, and even the cities were different. The two major cities in Northern Ireland are Derry and Belfast, and in Derry, for example, there's a river runs down the middle of it. And it is very much one side of the river is Catholic and the other side is Protestant. It may have changed now, but that was the case then. It was divided by a river, so it was it was very easy to become, I would imagine, radicalized in that situation. Whereas Belfast was much more like a patchwork quilt. There'd be pockets of one, and you could walk like sort of 4 or 5 blocks, and you'd be in a different, you'd be in the opposite. The opposite colour, if you like, and keep walking for another 5 blocks, and you'd be back out of it and back into the one you started in again. So, there were a lot of different environments, even within the very small environment of Northern Ireland. And the other thing that people forget is the entire population of Northern Ireland. When I was growing up, the whole country, there was only 1.5 million people there. So, it was in the grand scheme of things, it's a very small. It's a very small. I believe that the British even referred to it as an affordable war, because that's the way they looked at it.
Right. So you look at the times, though, especially as things started to come to a head in 76, 77, 78. You look at the economics of the whole of all of the UK between what was going on in London and in Ireland, and even here in the States, it did breed a certain emotion that I think that punk music really grew out of. I think here in the States it was more of like an artistic issue, but in England it was much more political and much more economic. There wasn't a lot for things for kids to do back then, other than to hang out, cause problems, and start bands. I mean, that's what it seemed like.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing certainly about being in a band like ourselves in Northern Ireland was both the bands and the audiences were mixed. There was no sectarian divide within the clubs and within the bands. And you know, I mean, I once had a conversation with the U2 boys years ago, and they were asking about the same thing because they were just about to come play in the North, and it's obviously way at the start of their career. And and you know, I mentioned that, you know, because they said, your band's got Catholics and Protestants in it. I said, yeah. And they said, is that normal up there? We didn't think it was. And I said, well, it is in the bands and it is in the audiences. You know, maybe, and I jokingly said, you know, maybe that's the answer to Northern Ireland's problems, is that everybody should join a punk rock band. You know, it's like the answer to the problems is like 10,000 punk rock bands. And I mean, it was just supposed to be an off-the-cuff remark. And then I saw Bono being interviewed on, I forget which show it was. I think it was either Kimmel or Letterman or something a few years ago. And he actually trotted the whole story back out again. I thought, jeez, he remembered that from years ago. I've forgotten it. But so yeah, I mean, within what we were doing, the religious thing just did not come up at all. It didn't matter, and that, you know, really that was it wasn't necessarily an eye opener, because, you know, I'd always thought along those lines. But, you know, looking back on it now, it was quite an eye opener. You know, it was like, in terms of, it didn't matter. We were all there because we liked the music. And I mean, when you got across to England, some bands were socially motivated. I mean, the whole Rock Against Racism movement and the bands that took part in that were all very socially motivated. I mean, the Clash were obviously the figurehead band,
right.
But there were others. I mean, there were bands like the Tom Robinson Band, for example, who we toured with. I mean, Tom was very socialist and left wing in his outlook, but, you know, Tom's big thing was, you know, he was openly gay at the time, when it was still, you know, certainly in Northern Ireland, you could be put in prison for being homosexual, which was, you know, a throwback to the dark ages, for Pete's sake. So yeah, there were a lot of it. But, you know, other people were just wanting to write pop songs. You know, I mean, the Undertones very famously took that stance, and you know, you look at people like the Buzzcocks, for example, who probably just wrote, you know, love songs, albeit again, you know, from a very intelligent point of view, but it was still, you know, you wouldn't class them as an overtly political band.
No, not at all. I mean, that's exactly. I mean, they were all love songs, but they were great at it. And even on the Undertones, you know, I want to talk about John Peel a little bit, and the importance of him, and certainly the Undertones were one of his all-time favorites. But, you know, before I get to that, there's a very interesting story about. I think it's a fascinating how your first singles come out, and it's really kind of almost like a do-it-yourself type of situation. And at some point, when you finally release your first album, Inflammable Material, it was the first independent album or independent record on an independent label that cracked the charts.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah. I mean, the thing about the first record was, you know, we'd been turned down by pretty much every record label in the country when we were trying to get a deal, and you know, we'd somewhat infamously in the band's story, we'd been promised a deal by Island Records, who at the last minute changed their minds and decided against it. By which stage we had actually all quit our jobs, because they'd even given us a date they wanted us to be in London for. So, you know, we kind of felt disillusioned. We were disillusioned with the music business before we were even actually really part of it, you know. But it did. I mean, it gave us a healthy distrust of record labels. So when we came to England, you know, we did the Tom Robinson tour, and at the time, Tom's band were huge. So it was a great break for us, and we were getting fantastic reviews. We were going down really well with the audiences, and we were convinced then, okay, this is all we needed to do, was to come here to prove how good we were, and hopefully now record labels have seen us. You know, we'll get a deal, and here we go. This is, you know, we're ready for liftoff kind of thing. And again, nobody was interested. So a second kick to the teeth, and it's towards the end of the tour, and we were talking to Jeff Travis, who was one of the founders of Rough Trade, and he said, you know, here you haven't had any luck getting a record deal. We really believe in the band. We've never made an album before, but how would you feel about making an album with us? And we said, well, sure. I mean, they'd done the Alternative Ulster single for us. And so we knew them as people, and they were really nice people. So we said, well, sure. And said, well, what sort of deal are we talking about? Because we'd been burned once, as I said, and Jeff sort of looked at us blankly and said, well, I don't really know. We've never done this before. How about once we take out the cost of recording it, we just split the money 50-50. Now, I mean, you try going to a major record deal and say we want to split the money 50-50. You won't get past the receptionist. They'll throw you out the door. So again, we had no idea whether that was a good deal or not. We went, okay, sounds fair to us, and we went in and we made the record. And again, Rough Trade were working on a sort of what they called a cartel approach to distribution. In fact, I think the company even called themselves the Cartel. Nothing at all to do with Pablo Escobar or people like that. It was a loose collection of independent record stores, which meant that the major chain stores in the UK, the likes of Virgin and I mean, it would have been Tower, people like that here,
right.
But it would have been Virgin, HMV, those people who were the main chart return shops, which is the other thing to bear in mind with regards to the record making the chart, was those stores didn't really carry the record. So it not only made the Apple chart, it made through going out through literally, it was on an independent label by an independent band going out through independent record stores. It was 100% an independent effort, and I mean it made the chart, and it was actually the highest new entry that week. First album ever to make the official chart. And interestingly, it sold even more the following week, but the BPI, the British Phonographic Institute, who monitored the chart and actually compiled the chart, were convinced by this stage that we must be rigging the chart because they'd never heard of us. And obviously, they were looking at the sales from the major chain stores, and there weren't any. So they're like, okay, we don't know how they're doing this, but they're obviously malfunctioning. So the buggers actually held us down when we should have gone up the following week. And that pretty much in terms of chart places, that killed the record stone dead. But the week after it continued selling, so they had to bump it back up again. But yes, so it's interesting. My entire life, people have said to me, so after the Smiths, you were the first band to independently crack the chart. I went, no, we did it before the Smiths.
That's such a wild story because I mean, I would imagine larger record labels are completely confused about what just happened. Seeing you guys show up on the chart at all.
And then suddenly everybody that turned us down. I think with the exception of A&M and CBS, they suddenly all came calling. And we're like, oh, we've always loved your band. I went, no, you haven't.
Here's the letter that says you don't.
Yes, exactly. Well, in fact, that was the thing. When we signed with Chrysalis, we actually still had the letter from them that said they weren't interested. So we put it on the back of the first album that we made for them. And we were going to use the original one they sent us, which had Chris Briggs' signature on it. But Chris, by that stage, had moved on to work for EMI. But we got in touch with him and said, we're thinking of doing this. And luckily, he had a sense of humor about it and laughed and said, sure, go ahead. But his bosses at EMI were like, look, we're paying you a lot of money to sign bands, and we don't want you looking like an idiot on the back of somebody else's record. So they basically said, would you please not do that? So, we just put a blank. We left the signature blank, but it was the same letter.
I mentioned John Peel a couple of minutes ago, and we here in the United States didn't have somebody like a John Peel, and it's really too bad because I think what John Peel represented on the BBC was somebody who was very forward thinking and had the ability to really introduce music to an audience that may never have heard some of these bands, and you guys were certainly among them. Tell me about a little bit about John Peel.
Well, I mean, I've long argued that Peel was the single most important person in the British music scene, probably since 1967 when he first joined Radio 1. I mean, Peel was giving radio sessions to people like Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin and T-Rex when nobody else was playing them. He's responsible for so many bands and so many musicians being heard that would otherwise never have been heard. I mean, it's understandable why there wasn't a John Peel here, even though actually he got his first start in radio in Dallas of all places. it's because the country's just too big. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Peel had this captive audience as well, simply because he was the only person on the national station playing this stuff. And I mean, even before punk rock came out, I used to listen to Peel. I mean, Peel introduced me to so many bands that I would otherwise have totally missed out on. I mean, bands that some went on to do really well, others not so much, and. But that didn't matter. I bought and loved the records just to see him, and I wasn't alone. And the thing about the BBC is it's supposed to be the same as like PBS here. It's supposed to be a public service broadcaster. They kind of had to put up with him, which was something he reveled in. He was almost unfireable. Because we need to cater to these people somewhere. Oh, give it to Peel, So he was actively. I mean, again, I was lucky enough. I worked at BBC Radio 1 for a year, and I got to see Peel work at first hand. I mean, I didn't actually work on his program or any of the late night shows, but we were all in the office, and you'd walk past Peel's office, and it was mayhem. I mean, there were just tapes piled everywhere, sky high in there, and he would get sackloads of mail from bands like Europe-wide almost, who were desperate to get a Peel session or to get a play on his show. And the astonishing thing about John, as opposed to any of the other DJs there, was he actually did listen to every damn tape he got. It was incredible to walk past there, just to see the man's dedication. So yeah, Peel was hugely important.
And he was championing bands that would never have gotten any radio airplay at all. Maybe
God no, yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
I think of his his support of a band like The Fall. I mean, that's you either love The Fall or you don't understand The Fall. But he was all over that band and loved them. And you would never see that here in the United States. Most people in the United States, if you say I'm a big fan of The Fall, they look at you blankly like, what the hell are you talking about? But it's an important band.
He was also huge. He was also wonderfully human. I mean, I believe he initially wanted to call his autobiography, Right Side, Wrong Speed, because he would invariably, he more than once played an entire album at the wrong speed and then raved about how great it was at the end of it, even though the band were actually on the phone frantically trying to get through to him, saying, "You're playing it at the wrong speed." But that's just magnificently human, It's just, and at first, it's easy to laugh at something like that. But when you saw the amount of the music he actually listened to during a week, it's perfectly understandable to go, don't remember it being that fast, but okay.
So the last album that Stiff Little Fingers put out was, if I'm not mistaken, the last studio record was 2014, and No Going Back. And there had been a period of time where you hadn't released a whole hell of a lot, but then you started a crowdsourcing campaign for that record, and you were inspired by the sex scandal in the Catholic Church, and that seemed to really light a creative fire under you. I assume mostly out of outrage, like everybody else. What was it about that scandal that said to you, this is what I need to write about?
Well, I mean, that was just one song on the record, but I mean, basically, as much as I would love to, I've never been able to write a love song, or to write. It always comes out as dreadful high school poetry whenever I try to write. Even though I'm 62 years old and I've been happily married for over 15 years, and it's still, I still can't write a love song. I just can't do it. It looks and sounds false to me, even though you write it with the best of intentions. But what I am good at doing, or I seem to be good at doing, is articulating my own anger. And so, I've invariably been drawn to and written songs about things that have offended my sense of justice. I mean, it's really that simple, So it's to that end, I just see it as another rung in the long ladder of protest singers. That's basically where I see it. And a song like "Guilty of Sin," which is the song you're referencing, that's just the ultimate in terms of offending my sense of justice, because it's targeting and abusing the weakest and most vulnerable in society. And you're targeting children who are in your care and who you're responsible for, and who have got they're aware that they've got any right to defend themselves, but they've got absolutely no power and no way to defend themselves. And it's just, I hesitate to use the word evil about anything or anyone, but I think that, if I was asked to try and define it, that sort of abuse would be pretty close to my definition of what evil was.
I agree, and I think it's the way that they behaved as a result of this only dug that hole deeper and deeper. And
Absolutely.
yeah, it
And it wasn't just. I mean, it wasn't just the church. I mean, the church were the main target, and because they're obviously the biggest serial abusers. But it also was coming to light in Britain at the time that there were many members of Parliament who'd been that had been engaged in paedophile rings and had been covered up, and even sports people were brought into it, and most famously a British DJ called Jimmy Savile was exposed, and there'd been rumours about these people for years. But it's one of those things, it's again sort of it's the power thing, isn't it? It's like, well, who's going to take them on? You haven't got the power to fight these people. If you take them to court, if you accuse them of this, they're just going to sue you into the ground. You haven't got the resources to fight them, and again, it's that offence of the sense of justice that is bound to raise the hackles on my neck and make me reach for a guitar and a pen and a pad.
I want to talk about something a little bit lighter, a little bit happier. I in preparing for this interview,
we're not exactly a laugh a minute band, I'm afraid.
Well, no, maybe not. But well, you did try to put a rejection letter on the back of a record. That is pretty funny.
Yeah. Well, we actually did it. We didn't try to do it. We did it.
In preparing for this interview, I stumbled across something that I had completely forgotten was out there, and that was the 2005 Three Men and Black. It's you, it's Pauline Black from Selector, Bruce Foxton, who played with Stiff Little Fingers and the Jam, and Jean-Jacques Burrell from the Stranglers. And it's acoustic versions of your songs, and you don't necessarily think of Stiff Little Finger songs as lending themselves well to an acoustic version, but damn, those were great versions of those songs for you. Very, very well done. I don't know if you feel the same way, but I thought it was really good.
Yeah, no, I had a lot of fun doing it. I mean, I was nervous at first when I was asked to do it, simply for exactly the reasons you've just said. I didn't see those songs lending themselves to it, or I didn't see how I could do it. And actually, also, this is a bizarre thing. Also, at the time, I didn't really have I had one acoustic guitar, which was terrible. It's this cheap old thing that I just, I'd picked up along the way somewhere. And I'm like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to need a better guitar. And I'd remembered somebody write to me from a guitar company saying, if you ever think of doing your songs in an acoustic style, we'd love to be involved. And I thought, I remember at the time sort of pushing the email to the back of my mind thinking, yeah, right, going to do our stuff on an acoustic guitar. That's not going to work. And so I got in touch with this guy, and today turned out to be a guitar company from Northern Ireland called Loudon, who are hideously expensive guitars. I mean, there's no way on God's green earth I would have afforded one. So that was, that suddenly I thought, well, they've given me this very expensive guitar. The least I can do is take it out and play it in public, And yeah, the Three Men in Black thing, I felt slightly comfortable about doing it simply because the people who were originally suggested to do it were Pauline and Jean-Jacques, both of whom I knew really well. And originally Steve Diggle from the Buzzcocks was supposed to be the third man. And Steve had fallen off a motorcycle on vacation and broken his wrist just before we were supposed to go into rehearsal, so he couldn't do it. So we just went ahead with the two of myself and JJ and Pauline's guitar player, Nick Welsh, from the Selector, who's also a hugely talented artist in his own right. So that was the initial thing. Yeah, and I mean, it was a lot of fun to do. And it gave me the confidence to do a few other things. I've done another thing with Segzi and Ruffy and from the Ruts and Kirk Brandon from Spear of Destiny. We go out as Dead Men Walking. We've done a few tours under that banner, and that's actually been a lot of fun as well. And again, then I got asked by the Dropkicks to go out and open for them just completely on my own. I think I've done two or three tours I've done now with the Dropkicks. I did one where they had Rancid, and I did the East Coast shows with them then. And then it was two legs. Of another one, there was the Dropkicks and Flogging Murphy, and I did all 6 weeks of that one. And yeah, that's actually quite nerve-wracking. I mean, because obviously you know yourself coming from Massachusetts that the Dropkick Murphys are pretty popular.
Yeah, they're
those
well
boys
known.
Can sell a ticket.
They've done okay here.
So yeah, you'd go out in front of particularly the indoor shows. So, you'd stand at the side of the stage and the lights would go down and there'd be, one light on one microphone in the middle of this big stage. And you walk out to the sound of your own footsteps and there's like 7,000 pairs of eyes staring at you. And you're like, okay, there's nowhere to hide here. If I screw this up, they're going to know it's me. So, that was kind of nerve-wracking. But it was a lot of fun, and it was a learning curve. And, again, those guys are just such nice people to be around as well, that they just made the whole thing so easy, and their audience were very, very kind, which was good, because there was a lot of them and only one of me.
Well, they're good guys. I mean, they've done a lot of charitable shows, in our area and throughout the state. I mean, that's a band with a lot of heart, and I think people around here really respect that.
Yeah, they definitely they wear their heart on their sleeve. They're the real deal, those boys. They really are.
So, is there any movement on maybe like a new music coming out for you?
Yeah, no, nothing else to do at the minute, Mike, so we're writing. It's like our guitar player sent me through this photograph of his. He said, I remodeled the whole home studio. I bought all this new equipment. He sent me through this photograph of all this flashy-looking gear. I said, that's great. I said, do you know how to switch it all on yet? He went, no. It's a slow process. It's always been a slow process with us. But we've already got about 4 or 5 songs, I think, that we're happy with. And once we've got an album's worth, then we'll take it from there. I know that the whole crowdsourcing thing sadly has gone a bit down the pan a bit, because the people who ran Pledge Music, who we worked with before, have gone out of business, and but there are other platforms along that line if we wanted to do that. We've also, since we did a follow-up live record and DVD, and that was picked up by a label called Ear Music in Germany, who are actually keen to keep us on the label and do the next album with them. So we've got options when we finally actually get our finger out and finish writing it, really.
Well, I can't wait for it. Jake, I appreciate the time today. Best of luck. Stay healthy. Can't wait till you guys are able to come around to the States again, and I hope to see you when you do.
Thank you very much, Mike. Appreciate it, and thank you for the time as well.
So that was pretty cool, huh? Jake Burns from Stiff Little Fingers. Listen, if you like the show, tell your friends, share with everybody, and feel free to make comments. Even better, leave a nice review while you're at it. That would be awesome. You can reach me at BaxterRock102.com. Thanks for listening to Baxy's Musical Podcast.